So first, thank you to Thomas and for hosting this and for everybody who is attending. I've probably met some of you before at various conferences or whatnot, but and hopefully I'll get to meet you in person down the road. What I wanted to do today was give a little bit of background about what I mean when I'm talking about EEG neuromeditation. There are other ways to think about neuromeditation than what I'm presenting, but to give you an overview of kind of the way that I think about it and the program that we have developed. And so I want to walk you through some of the basics and then show you some of my, show you kind of a playback of a session so that you can actually kind of see what the neurofeedback screen looks like and what we're doing for some of this. Obviously, there's a lot that goes into this program. So I'm going to jump right in. And the first thing that wanted to just briefly kind of, in terms of introducing myself before I just start talking, is just to give a little bit of background for how this came about and how we came to develop the system that we're using. So first, I'm a psychologist, and I'm currently living in Eugene, Oregon in the United States. And I've been involved in a lot of different meditation traditions dating back to the 90s. And some of those include Zen and Vipassana. I've also studied Qigong and Taoism quite a bit. I taught mindfulness-based stress reduction at the University of Missouri for 4 years, those of you who are familiar with that program. So I have a few different orientations to how I think about meditation. And then I've been involved in neurofeedback since about 2000. And so, of course, it's not a big leap to imagine that you would want to combine these things. And I started doing that really with some of the work of Richard Suter. He's the guy up in the corner picture there. In about 2008, I went to a workshop that he was giving. And at that point, largely, most of the meditation work with neurofeedback was alpha up training at the back of the head and alpha theta training, both of which are wonderful, very powerful programs. I did some of that, and personally, it didn't do a whole lot for me. Now I kind of have an understanding of why, looking back and knowing my own brain a little bit better. So that kind of got me started. And then really things really took off for us about 3 or 4 years ago, probably 4 years ago, and wrote a chapter in the book, Handbook of Clinical Acute EEG and Neurotherapy. That was our first really attempt to articulate some of the ways that we are advancing some of these ideas about neuromeditation, what that can look like beyond alpha training and beyond alpha theta training. And then that developed into a workshop that I did for years with a company called PESI, where they would send me around to different parts of the country to teach some of these concepts, and then wrote the book, Meditation Interventions to Rewire the Brain, and then have developed the Neuromeditation Institute. So there's my introduction. Let's get into the content. So first, it's important for me to just explain that the way that I am talking about meditation in this program is really as mental training. This is the way that we're thinking about it and talking about it. And this is important because typically meditation is associated with spiritual traditions. And certainly that is a very important aspect of what meditation can be. But for us, it's important to recognize that you don't have to believe anything and you can still benefit from meditation. You don't have to be Buddhist, you don't have to be Hindu to be able to engage in meditation and use it in ways that can benefit you. So for us, we talk about this in a very Western, non-esoteric type of language to try to make it as accessible to everybody as possible. This is the definition of meditation that we use in our program. So it's a systematic mental training designed to challenge habits of attending, thinking, feeling, and perceiving. And again, we like this definition because it really does point to that idea that meditation is mental training, and that largely what you're doing in meditation is challenging the habitual ways that the mind processes information. So challenging the normal, if you want to think of them as normal, ways that we pay attention, ways that we engage with the world, ways that we think and feel about ourselves. Meditation is largely about noticing what those habits are and then learning to skillfully do something with that. We know from a lot of research that's been done over the last 20 years that meditation works. And when I say meditation works, I'm talking about from a mental health perspective. I'm a psychologist, and so a lot of my interest comes from how can I use meditation to help others. And now we have just piles and piles of research showing that meditation does, or I should say can be, a very effective intervention for a lot of mental health concerns. So you see all of those listed on this page, and that's not exhaustive, of course, but that's a pretty big list, and it's pretty consistent with what most of us are doing if you're working with mental health. So the question, of course, becomes, well, great, how do we do that? So meditation is good for us. It helps with a lot of things, but is there more specific information? Because one of the things that we became aware of very quickly is that meditation means a lot of different things. It's not just one thing. And this is confusing to a lot of people in terms of how the definition of meditation or mindfulness is even worse in some ways. The ways that people use the term mindfulness can mean a lot of different things. So for us, what we want people to really recognize is that all meditations are not created equal. They're not all the same. It depends. It depends on how you're using your attention. It depends on what your intention is. It depends on which brainwave patterns are engaged and in what brain regions. So for us, those four things really define what style of meditation it is. And so what we've done is looked at a lot of the research literature and identified 4 different styles of meditation that are very consistent in terms of states of consciousness that different types of meditation programs seek to achieve. And there's a 5th style that I'll talk about at the very end that we've just started working with more intensely. So the 4 styles that I want to talk about briefly to introduce you to are focus, mindfulness, open heart, and quiet mind. And we tried to pick terms to describe these that were very intuitive. So when you hear open heart, you have a very easy understanding of what that meditation is probably about, and you're probably right. So focus meditations are going to be any kind of a practice where you are holding your attention on a single target. You're holding your attention on one thing, and when the mind wanders, you recognize that the mind wanders and you bring it back. So this is a basic meditation practice that most people are familiar with, watching the breath, for example, or following a mantra, using a word or a phrase to hold the attention. So really this is about voluntary control of attention and cognitive processes. You're teaching your mind to be able to be still. So there's a lot of different practices that do that in different ways. So we can kind of lump all of those together into this category of focus. Mindfulness, I already suggested that people are defining mindfulness in a lot of different ways. So the way that we're talking about mindfulness is a non-judgmental awareness of the present moment. So you're observing what's happening moment to moment. You're observing your thoughts, your feelings, your bodily sensations, and you're allowing them to exist, but then letting them go without attachment, without holding on, without creating a story about what just was observed. So again, there's a lot of ways to do mindfulness. Open heart, this is going to include any kind of loving kindness or compassion practices. But we use the term open heart instead of just saying loving kindness, because we wanted it to be a little bit of a broader category to include things like gratitude or forgiveness, that those can also fit in here. And so, of course, a big component of these practices is engaging, activating a specific feeling state, and then usually then sending that energy, sending that intention to others, or sending it to yourself. So again, you can see that while that might have some elements of focus involved, it's also different in that you're engaging your emotions. And then quiet mind, this is the fourth category. And so we're talking about a spacious awareness and expanded consciousness. So this is what most people tend to think of when they think of meditation, that the mind should be empty or it should be quiet somehow. And it's important to help people recognize, I think, that that's only one element of certain styles of meditation. That's not the only way to meditate. It's an important way and it's a useful way, but it's only one way. So once we have these four styles identified, and by the way, I should point out that a lot of this came from these two research articles that I have cited on the slide. The first one, Travis and Shear, they identified three of these categories very clearly by looking at the research literature and looking at brainwave patterns with meditation. And you can see in the name of their article that they picked slightly different names for the meditation styles. So focused attention, open monitoring, and automatic self-transcending. So for us, those correspond to focus, mindfulness, and quiet mind. Now, they did not include open heart as a category, and we added it because we think it's distinct enough and important enough that it deserves its own category. Now, one of the things that was very important about this article that Travis and Shear did was they were also looking at the brainwave patterns associated with these different styles. So we're going to get to that in just a minute. Before we get to that, I wanted to talk about another element of our program, which is trying to help people identify which type of meditation style might be the best fit for them. Again, recognizing that they're not all created equal. And also with the understanding that people may be able to identify and individualize which kind of meditation they're using based on what they're trying to achieve. Why are they meditating in the first place? And so again, this is coming from a perspective that a lot of people right now are starting to meditate because they want to feel better. They're not necessarily looking for enlightenment. If they're looking for enlightenment, then this probably isn't the best program for them. Although maybe that could happen. But that's not really our focus. Our focus is on helping people to be well. And so you can see here I kind of identified some of the goals and some of the targets of these different practices. So for example, if somebody has ADHD, it kind of makes sense that maybe the focus practice would be ideal for them. It might be the hardest for them. They're going to have a hard time holding their attention, but that's the way that the brain is going to build that capacity to pay attention to a single thing and hold your attention. So what we've done is kind of identified which practices might be best for which things. And this isn't meant to be the only way to look at this, but it's a good starting point for people. And it's a nice way to help people figure out what might be a great place for them to begin with their meditation practice. I also want to point out that one of the things we try to do is give people a lot of options about how they can engage in these different practices, recognizing that for a lot of people, just sitting on a cushion and watching their breath is not going to work. It's going to be way too difficult and they're not going to do it. So recognizing that we need to find additional strategies to help people find and stay in these states. So one of the tools that we've created is the Neuromeditation Styles Inventory. And you can find this on our website at the www.neuromeditationinstitute.com/NMSI. And so this is just a free, simple tool that asks a bunch of questions, and then it gives you a score for each of the 4 styles. So again, this is just an easy way for people to start to think about, what do I need? What am I looking for? And which meditation style might be a good match? Now let's get back to the brainwaves, since that's what everybody's interested in. So this slide is a very oversimplified way of thinking about these 4 styles and the brainwaves involved. And this comes from that research article that we just talked about, the Travis and Shear article. This is kind of what they identified. They identified that very consistently in research, if somebody is engaged in a focus meditation, they will find increases in either beta 2 or gamma. Now, that by itself is actually important to point out, is that not all meditations result in slow brain patterns. Many of them do, and actually for many of them, it's a combination. Some regions of the brain speed up and are activated, and some regions of the brain slow down and get quiet. So this is really important for us to understand. With mindfulness, the basic brainwave pattern that we see very frequently is an increase of something called frontal midline theta. So obviously theta is a slow brainwave, but frontal midline theta is kind of a special case of theta that actually is involved in some active tasks, including orienting and certain kinds of attention. So it makes sense to me that mindfulness is going to show a little bit of a different brainwave pattern than focus, because you're using your attention in different ways. Open heart practices, we already mentioned, fall into the same category as loving kindness and compassion. And many of you are familiar with the work of Richie Davidson at the University of Wisconsin, working with the Tibetan monks and looking at what is happening in their brain during a compassion meditation. And he's not the only one who has done this kind of research. But what you see is that during a loving kindness or a compassion-based meditation, the biggest pattern is increased gamma, again, in specific regions that we'll talk about in a minute. And then we have quiet mind. Now, quiet mind, this is going to be a practice like Zen. Zen tends to fit in here. So does transcendental meditation. And both of those practices really show increases of alpha 1. And so for those of you that may not be familiar, alpha is generally thought of as being from 8 to 12 hertz, give or take. And a lot of researchers and clinicians now are kind of breaking that up into smaller categories. Alpha 1 and alpha 2 are the most common. Alpha 1 generally being from 8 to 10 hertz. So it's the slower part of alpha. And this is what we're seeing very consistently with a quiet mind practice. So this is the basic kind of orientation. We know that there are different brain waves that show up with different meditation styles. So what I wanted to do today, because we're obviously not going to have time to go through everything in great detail, there's just not time for that. But what I wanted to do was to try to give you a little bit of a more thorough picture of what this might look like for at least one meditation style, and how we translate this into a neurofeedback protocol. So we're going to do focus because that's usually the easiest one to start with in explaining this, because people really understand this meditation because it's a much more straightforward practice. So again, we talked about focus as being a voluntary control of attention. And again, you can think of these practices as any kind of a practice where you are holding your attention on a single target. Again, it could be the breath, it could be a mantra, it could be an image of the Buddha, it could be anything really. It could be a candle flame. But the idea of holding your attention on one object, and then the attention will wander, because that's what happens. The mind will wander. You'll start thinking about something else, recognizing that the attention has wandered, and then gently and patiently and non-judgmentally bringing your focus back. That's kind of the whole practice. And we already talked about that it increases fast brainwave activity. So this is a good practice for things like building focus, building your capacity to sustain attention. So executive functioning. So based on some of the improvements that you're likely to see with this practice, it shouldn't be a big surprise that the region that is activated here is in the frontal lobes. So let's look at that. This is a really important article for this particular practice. Mind wandering and attention during focused meditation. And they were using an fMRI scanning technique to measure people's brains during a focused meditation practice. And really well done study, very interesting. And this is kind of what they hypothesized, and actually what they found, is that there are 4 parts to a focus practice. So let's start with the sustained focus part of this. So you're holding your attention on something. So let's say the breath. So sustained focus, you're watching your breath, you're watching your breath, you're watching your breath. And then the mind wanders. You start thinking about your significant other, or you start thinking about dinner or a work project. So then it goes up to the mind wandering up at the top of the page. Then you become aware that the mind wandered. And then you shift your attention back to the breath, and then you hold your attention on the breath. So there's kind of this circular process that happens during this practice. And what they were really hypothesizing was that the attention networks would be activated during any of the components where you're sustaining your attention, or you're becoming aware of the mind wandering or shifting back to that, and that the default mode network would be activated during the mind wandering. So this was their hypothesis, and that's basically what they found, but they actually got more specific information than that. So here's a really nice diagram that looks at these 4 stages of focused meditation. And now this diagram, I didn't create it, obviously, but they're starting with mind wandering. But I'm going to start down at the bottom again with sustaining focus. So you can see that when you're holding your attention on something, what they found in this study was that those executive networks, that dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, is really what lit up when you're holding your attention on one thing. And look where that's at. It's right in the prefrontal lobes. So again, you can imagine why this is so good for something like ADHD. You're really engaging that frontal lobe and exercising it. Then you see what happens when the mind wanders. All of a sudden, all of these other areas light up that are part of the default mode network. So the posterior cingulate, the precuneus, inferior parietal lobe, all of those areas, the medial prefrontal, the areas that are all associated with the default mode network. We'll talk more about this in a minute, but this is the part of the brain that is associated with us thinking about ourselves or thinking about something in relation to ourselves. So when the mind wanders, that's what we're doing. When the mind wanders, we're not thinking about the breath anymore. Now we're thinking about something about ourselves. We're thinking about having to eat lunch or whatever. So a whole bunch of brain regions get activated during that. Then up at the top, distraction awareness. So this is the awareness of mind wandering. And you see what happens. All of a sudden now the salience network becomes activated. And that's what the salience network does. The salience network is very important in helping us identify what is important to pay attention to. What should I be paying attention to right now? So during that portion of the meditation, the salience network, which is largely composed of the insula and the anterior cingulate, that becomes active. Then shifting attention, here we go back to the executive network. So shifting attention, we have the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and the inferior parietal lobule, both, until we go back to just focusing on the one thing. So this is a really important way of understanding what's happening during this practice. Now, when starting to think about how to translate this and what's most important for a neurofeedback protocol, what I've found is that really we don't need to pay attention to all four of these. That's too much. That's too much to try to regulate and modulate during this kind of a practice. So what we focus on is numbers 1 and 4 on this chart. So the times when the brain is focused and the times when the brain is distracted. The other things, when the salience network is involved and when that inferior parietal lobule kicks in, those are really transition states. So being aware that the mind is wandering and then reorienting it. So from a neurofeedback perspective, I'm less interested in trying to capture that. I'd rather capture the states that are going to be a little bit more pronounced. So we have these two that we need to deal with. This dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and then also the default mode network. So there's two areas that we try to address as far as that first part, being focused, with the neurofeedback protocols that we've developed for this particular style. So we can look directly at the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, of course. And if you're using BrainMaster equipment and software and you have S-Loretta, you could toggle straight to Brodmann area 46. If you're using a 2-channel protocol, and we have both in our program, we have both S-Loretta protocols and we have 2-channel protocols for people who aren't using S-Loretta right now. So you can see that the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, it's involved in things like active rehearsal, which actually that's what you're doing when you're holding your attention on something. You're repeating an attentional task, but then also sustaining attention. So in some other work, actually a book by Thompson and Thompson on cognitive neuroscience, they really identified that F4, that right side of the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, might be even more important in terms of selecting and sustaining attention than the left side. So you can already start to see where we're going with this protocol. We could put a sensor at F4, or if we're using S-Loretta, we could target Brodmann area 46. And you can certainly in the S-Loretta protocols make it just right-sided. So Brodmann area 46, just the right side. Now, we also address the anterior cingulate in some of these protocols because this is also an important area in terms of sustaining attention. So if you look at some of the things involved in the anterior cingulate, it's involved in monitoring cognition to predict errors. Well, that's partly what you're doing when you're doing a focused meditation. It's also involved in increased vigilance and arousal, as well as motivation. So you can see where this part of the brain might also be an important factor in a focused meditation. So we can also target this. So we can target either or both of these, depending on what we want to do. And what you'll see in a few minutes is that we've really been advancing some of our protocols and providing more options. And the reason that we're doing that is because we're recognizing that even within a specific type of meditation, like focus, my brain may not behave exactly the same way that Thomas's brain behaves, because we're different people. We have different brainwave patterns. And so we need to be able to be flexible enough to shift the protocols for each individual person. And so that may involve changing brain regions and also which brain waves we are monitoring. Now, you remember I also pointed out that the other brain region that we really need to look at is the default mode network, because this is what's involved in mind wandering. So the other areas that we were looking at, that's the focus part. This is the mind wandering part. So you can see it kind of simplified in the image on this screen. So this is really the mind shifting off target. So while we want the anterior cingulate and those executive networks to be activated, we do not want this to be activated. We want this to be quiet. We don't want to be mind wandering. We don't want to be thinking about ourselves. That's the exact opposite of what we want to be doing during a focused meditation. So how do we address this? So the basic idea is that we want to reward either the anterior cingulate cortex and or the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, and we want to inhibit either the precuneus or the posterior cingulate. Now we choose those two regions because those are really the hub of the default mode network. Now, again, in S-Loretta, you could identify the entire default mode network. We found that that's really not necessary, that if you really target the precuneus or the posterior cingulate, then you get really just as much impact as the entire default mode network. And so from a two-channel perspective, we're going to be dealing with either FZ or F4 up at the front, and then PZ in the back. So what I wanted to do was to show you a little quick demonstration of what this kind of looks like using an S-Loretta screen and targeting the protocol that I put up, that I will put up, is going to be showing you the anterior cingulate and the posterior cingulate. Okay, let me change what I'm sharing here. Okay, can everybody see my brain avatar screen? I'm going to assume that's a yes.
Yes.
Oh, awesome. Okay, so I'm just going to play back a session. So this is a 19-channel session because I've got a cap on somebody, and I'm using S-Loretta. And so, of course, we could look specifically at things like, the gamma in the anterior cingulate. So we could view that if we want. Now, in this protocol, that's what I'm measuring. I'm measuring gamma in the anterior cingulate. That is my way of rewarding, so to speak, activation in that area. So I want that area to be active. Now, I got to be careful using the terms reward and inhibit here, because we are really not using these protocols the same exact way as normal neurofeedback protocols, because we're not trying to push something. I'm not trying to make gamma go higher just for the sake of it going higher. I'm really using this information to observe and get feedback on states of consciousness. So basically, when somebody is focused and they're holding their attention, the gamma is going to be higher. And when the brain and the mind gets distracted, or they float off into space, or they're not paying attention, the gamma here is going to drop. Now, at the same time that I'm measuring this, I'm also measuring alpha, or alpha 1 in this case, in the posterior cingulate. Now you can see it's red because it's super high. It's kind of maxed out. And the reason that I'm using alpha 1 here, and I'm increasing it, I just said a second ago we want to inhibit activation of the posterior cingulate. But if you remember what I was talking about with the quiet mind protocols, you see alpha 1 there. When there's a lot of alpha 1, the mind often tends to be very quiet. There's not a lot going on. So that's one way that we can measure quietness in the default mode network. You could also turn this into an inhibit of beta or beta 2 or something like that. That also works really well. It just depends on the individual and kind of what you're interested in. Now, this is actually, I'm playing back myself, a session that I've done with myself. And for me, alpha 1 works really well. So that's why I'm using this particular setup. So this is the screen that's really the most important screen. The other ones are just interesting, but this is the important one. And so what you see is the yellow line is measuring gamma activity in the anterior cingulate, and it's not moving a whole lot. And that's because it's gamma. Gamma is a very fast brain wave, and we're measuring it between 35 and 50 hertz, which is actually a pretty narrow range for a brainwave that's that fast. So it's not going to wiggle very much. It's a tiny little thing. It's got very small amounts of power. So it's not going to move a whole lot. Now, at the same time, you can see the alpha 1 in the posterior cingulate and how much that moves. That moves a lot. And so again, this is why that's a good measure for me. So we're actually wanting to do two things at the same time here. So let's talk about gamma in the anterior cingulate. So basically, this is just making sure that the person is focused. Now, the anterior cingulate is involved in sustaining attention. So if there is a lot of gamma here, while the person is meditating, it's a pretty safe assumption that they're focused. Now, the only problem is we don't know what they're focused on. They could be focused on their breath, but they could also be focused on, something related to work, some kind of a problem that maybe they're obsessing about. So you'll also see obsessiveness show up in the anterior cingulate as well. So it's active, but we don't know what it is active on. We don't know what they're thinking about. Of course, we've given them instruction and they've had some coaching, because this process is not just neurofeedback. We also have to be a meditation coach. We have to be able to give them some instructions on how to guide their mind, their state of mind, into these specific states. So the reason that the gamma in the ACC is there is to make sure that they're paying attention to something. And what you will very often see with this is that it is, pretty high, like kind of like this one. It's just hanging out in this area, and it will do that until all of a sudden the mind starts getting either tired, or the mind starts spacing out, or what happens for some people when they start meditating, that all of a sudden they just float off into space and they're not paying attention to anything. Now, if any of those happen, that gamma is going to drop pretty dramatically. So for me, I don't need to ride this gamma and try to push it, because again, I'm not trying to make it go higher. I just want to make sure that it's helping the person be aware of whether they're focused or not. So I'm likely to put the threshold kind of right where it's at right now. And they might be getting 100% reward in this case. And I'll talk about the rewards in a moment. And that's okay with me, because as long as they're focused, then they should be getting 100%. Again, this is different than normal neurofeedback. Now, the one that's going to move a lot more is this alpha. this one is really monitoring what we are paying attention to. So the first one is telling us, are they paying attention? The second one is, what are you paying attention to? Now, it's not like we can read minds, obviously. We don't know exactly what they're paying attention to. But we do know that if the default mode network is active, that they're probably thinking about themselves and they're probably not meditating. That is going to be what we see when this alpha is really low. So when the alpha is low, they're actually not engaged in the meditation. They're thinking about something else, kind of like right now. And then when they are focused and there's nothing else going on in the mind is quiet except for that easy focus on one thing, this alpha one is going to be quite high. So this is the one that's going to move a lot more because the mind is going to be constantly shifting between focused and distracted. Look where it's at right now. Look how low the alpha is. Clearly, I was not focused on my target right then. But here, look, I've shifted back. Now there's this nice increase. Okay, so this is what we want in this protocol. And how do we reward somebody? Because we want them to have clear information about if they're in the right state of consciousness or not. And so this is all eyes closed, which means we're using sound. And we have worked with a lot of different approaches to this. And this is a tricky one. I'm going to show you a new piece of software that is coming out any moment. And I just happened to get access to it early. It's called Mind Track. And this will work with the Brainmaster software. And let me show you my screen so you can see what I'm doing with this little interface. Okay, there we go. So there's a simple interface that allows me to pick what events in Brainmaster I want to use. And I can pick a song that I want. There's a lot of built-in electronic songs with no lyrics. You can also choose custom and upload your own song that you have that you like. So I like using this song called Adrift for meditation states. So I just loaded that up. You can change some of these factors in terms of how quickly the music fades. Also the minimum volume, which this is really important because one of the things that we have discovered with using music and sound for neuromeditation is that it works best if the music never cuts all the way out. So we don't want a signal that's on, off, because that's very disruptive when you're trying to meditate. So instead, what we want is to use a gentle music. I've got it on now, so you'll start to hear it. Let me change you back to my screen. To the where'd it go? There it is. Okay, so we're back to the Loretta screen, and you can hear how the volume increases when you are making connection, when you are in the right meditative state. So now listen, it's dropping because look at the gamma. The gamma dropped below threshold, so the volume went down. Now the reason the gamma went down was because I started getting sleepy. Now I'm distracted because the alpha dropped. There, now, whoops, didn't last. Let's see if I can get myself there. So you can hear the change in the music. Now the music I chose is just a nice, quiet, ambient, kind of like space music. And it works really well for a meditative state. And so you can hear, even though I'm not meeting criteria for the gamma, it didn't completely disappear. This is important because otherwise it totally pulls somebody out of the meditative state. I'll just be silent for a few seconds so you can kind of watch how it shifts and moves and get a sense for it. Okay, so I'm going to stop this and get back to the PowerPoint, but I wanted to give you a let me go back to the PowerPoint. There we go, and I gotta find where did the there we go. Gotta love technology. Okay, so hopefully, let's stay here for a moment. Hopefully that gave you a quick sense of kind of how those protocols work. It's actually very powerful because you're getting immediate information about your internal state. And like I said, even that basic protocol, we could change it so that instead of monitoring alpha 1 in the PCC, we're looking at beta. That might work better for somebody. Or instead of looking at the ACC, we're looking at you know, one of those other regions in the executive network, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, that might be a better fit. We actually have some protocols that we use 6 regions of interest. We're monitoring a whole lot of different things. And so we can make these very complicated. We can also make them very simple. So there's a range for everybody to kind of work with these protocols based on their comfort level with the software, but also the brain regions and meditative states. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this slide. I just wanted to show you that one of the things that's important for our program is that we also incorporate lots of other techniques and strategies besides just using neurofeedback. And so, because we want our students and our clients to learn the skill. That's the whole idea, is that not that they would come in and have every single time they meditate, they have to come into my office and put electrodes on their head, but that they're using that as a way to help them really learn and find what that state feels like so that they can do it on their own. And so we want them to have other strategies and skills. So this is where, again, our role becomes a little bit different, where we're doing neurofeedback, but we're also a little bit of a meditation coach. So we also teach how to use all of these different strategies in our program as well. I think I have, Thomas, do we only have a few minutes?
Yes, we still have a few minutes. It's 8:55, so still you can talk a little bit more if you like.
Okay, how long can I go?
Actually, the webinar was from 8 to 9 here in Germany. So 1 hour, we started a little bit later, so I would say 9:05, so 10 minutes.
Okay, I'll make it quick. Thank you, Thomas.
Great, you're welcome.
So I'm gonna jump over these other, I put these kind of slides for the other 4 strategies just as a way to kind of look at quickly, but what I would rather do in our few minutes remaining is to at least mention the 5th style. This is a style that we've been having a lot of success with and is very interesting and tends to get a lot of attention whenever we talk about it. So I wanted to at least bring it up here for you all. So the 5th style of meditation that we have been working with, sometimes we're calling it altered states, sometimes we're calling it deep states. It's a little bit of a tricky one. I actually like the term deep states better. But then it gets confusing because people use that to talk about alpha theta as well. And this is a little bit different. So this approach really has come out of the research on psychedelic medicines and what's happening in the brain. So I'm sure many of you are aware that there's been a lot of research lately looking at different psychedelic medicines, including LSD, psilocybin, ayahuasca, etc., and their impact on the brain. A lot of really good research done by a guy named Robin Carhart Harris at the Imperial College in London. And what's interesting about this research is that largely what they're finding is that when they are measuring people's brain patterns, brain activation or deactivation with these medicines, mostly what they're seeing is a decrease of activity, especially in the lower frequency bands. So delta, theta, alpha, and beta, and particularly alpha. So alpha drops dramatically when people are working with these medicines, and especially so in the posterior cingulate cortex. Now, this is important because, as you remember, the posterior cingulate cortex is the hub of the default mode network. It's us thinking about ourselves. And so something interesting is happening in the default mode network with these medicines. And we don't have a lot of time to get into all the details, but the basic idea is that these medicines, when used appropriately and properly, therapeutically, they help you change the way you think about yourself. So the old construct, the old belief system, the old stories about who you are really contained in that default mode network. You can think of it as your ego. And so when people are using these medicines appropriately, that network changes. And so it provides an opportunity for you to look at yourself differently. And you can look at your symptoms differently. And so it's not a big surprise that people are having very powerful therapeutic benefits when these medicines are used with the appropriate set and setting. So what we're interested in is what happens if we take some of that information and apply it to a neuromeditation protocol. So people aren't using any of the psychedelics while we're doing this. We're just using the neurofeedback with meditative states to see if this could be beneficial as well. So this is just a line graph from one of the sessions that we have done with somebody where we were inhibiting delta and alpha and beta in the precuneus, so using that as the hub of the default mode network. And we were also actually rewarding gamma in the occipital lobe, partly because some of the psychedelic research showed that, and also we thought it might be interesting to see if it enhanced any sort of visual information that the person received during the meditation. So this was one session. You can see there's a big change in what the brainwaves were doing at about the 16 or 17 minute mark. So the alpha and delta dropped pretty dramatically in the first 16 or 17 minutes. And then there was a huge increase. And that we see that very typically. We think what's happening is that that's when the ego kicks back into gear. We're kind of taking the ego offline, and then it can only do that for a little while before it gets anxious and wants to resume control. So that's kind of what's happening at that 17-minute mark where the alpha and delta spike back up. This is what, in this particular case, the person described during the session. Well, first they said it was hard to describe their experience. They felt like they were flying very fast. They would slow down, viewing the Milky Way from different viewpoints. So having this very, in some ways, kind of a psychedelic experience. They felt like they were part of something, yet part of nothing, whatever that might mean. Everything was happening at once and yet not at all. So immediately after the session, they described kind of a time distortion. It was difficult to find the right words to describe what was happening. They were getting kind of rapid flashes of nature in their mind. And then days after the experience, the meditation, they reported being very introspective, unusually calm, and very grounded, and also experiencing some headache relief. So now this is not this, people don't always have this kind of experience when they do this meditation, but it became clear to us that perhaps in some individuals, this could be something to help get people into a little bit of an altered state for therapeutic purposes. It's actually very consistent with some other research being done, decreasing alpha for post-traumatic stress disorder, decreasing alpha in the posterior cingulate, and getting really positive results. So that's the direction we're starting to look at with some of this work with the altered states protocol. The other thing that we're doing is combining the neuromeditation protocol with vibration, so using a sub-pack to translate music and sound into vibration, using the Proteus Light and Sound audio-visual entrainment system in conjunction with that, because we can also combine lights with the music so that they're coordinated. These can really help people get into a deeper state. Combining it with micro Tesla or the V-light, and then more basic things like using an eye guard, using evocative music to help get them into specific states. And then some of the things we're interested in doing in the future is combining this with other medicines, including cannabis, which is legal here in Oregon. So, you know, to see if that could be used as a therapeutic tool as well. So I know we're wrapping up. If you're interested in learning more about this, obviously this was just the tip of the iceberg, but I wanted you to get a sense of what the program is about and how some of the neuromeditation protocols work. That's the name of the book there. You can get it on Amazon if you're interested. I should tell you, the book is not really geared toward neurofeedback practitioners. It's more of a general book, but it has a lot of the extra strategies. And then obviously we have some upcoming workshops here in the United States and abroad. And obviously the one that Thomas was mentioning is the one in Mallorca in April. So very exciting. And here is some information. If you would like to get in touch with me, I'm happy to answer any questions as best I can. You might find some things on the website that would be of interest. And with that, I will turn it back over to Thomas, and thank you all very much for your time and interest.
Well, thank you very much, Jeff, for this very interesting webinar, for these insights in your work. And I tell you something, I will come definitely to your workshop. I would have done it anyway, but now I know that I really look forward to that workshop in April. And it's a fascinating thing to work with neurofeedback, to combine it and to really have this scientific background. Thank you very much. This was so good, and I really enjoyed your webinar. Are there any questions from our participants? You can use the chat box if you like. So we have a couple of minutes for answering some questions. I don't see the chat box now. Let me be the host real quick, okay?
Oh yeah, take the host back.
Yes, and so I can see more of the questions coming in, and I can then moderate that. Okay. Oh, looks like many people were also happy like me. And any question?
That's how good I was, Thomas. I explained everything. Nobody has any questions.
It was too good. No, nobody wants to ask questions. That's good. Yeah. For all the participants, I want to say something. If you recorded this session, we gave you the possibility to record the session. Please don't share this without our permission on any social media. You can use the recording for your own purposes. You can show it to your friends, of course, but please don't share it on social media because we will do sharing on YouTube and on other video platforms, but we will make sure that it's a nice recording and it's professionally made. Okay? Okay, there is one question. Oh, two even. Ah, there is a meditation test. Someone asked for that. And someone asked for train up gamma, but not muscle tension. Yeah, good question.
Yeah.
And there is any other research to neuroconstruction? Is there something? Okay, there is Glenn asking, how do you train gamma up but not muscle tension? Okay, that's a question for you.
Yeah, and that's an interesting question. And really the reality is we do the best we can, because of course, if there's muscle tension, that's going to affect all of those fast brainwave patterns. And so certainly we have concerns about that, but one of the things that's a big advantage for what we're doing is generally people are laying back in a reclining chair and their eyes are closed and they're not moving. Now, there's still eye wiggles and things like that, of course, that can influence the fast activity. But kind of like what you saw on the screen when I was demonstrating, there's actually not too much unless there's something big that happens, if there's a big movement. Otherwise, it stays pretty consistent, and then it will drop when the attention becomes lax. And so even though muscle tension is certainly an issue for us to deal with, it's not become really something that creates a lot of problems for us. And so we use gamma in a lot of protocols, and for us, kind of the proof is in the pudding in terms of, does it seem to help the person find their states, find the correct state, and is the gamma movement consistent with that? And we're finding that yes, it is. Yeah. So that's about the best answer I can give you, I think.
Oh yes, I think from my experience also, because we have seen a lot of gamma EEGs, and from if you have experience with which is muscle and which is gamma, this is why we have more than 10 years experience in watching at EEGs. You can differentiate very well, is it a gamma or not, and we have tried it with meditators to replicate that pattern. If you do it with muscle, it looks totally different than if you do it with real gamma. So we tried it many times. It's not possible to create that pattern with muscle tension. It's really something different. Okay, good. There is another question. Oh, and now many questions come up here. Okay, next question is about, can you tell something about neuroconstruction?
Yeah. I don't know if I know exactly what it looks like. Maybe Juan was.
Not it's neuroconstructivism.
Yeah, I might need that kind of defined a little bit better for me. Maybe we can hold off on that one and have it as a side conversation, because that might be a bigger conversation as well, it sounds like.
We have a very nice Facebook website, Facebook group, which is called Neurofeedback and Neuroscience. We can discuss this there as well.
Oh, that'd be great.
That would be great. Okay. So this is we solved that problem.
Yeah.
The other question is from Nazul and Itabasam. How much effective it has proved in treating anxiety and depression?
Yeah, great question. And so I can answer it a couple of ways. I can answer it from my experience and also extrapolating from other research with meditation that's not necessarily using neurofeedback. Unfortunately, this idea of combining neurofeedback with meditation is still pretty new, and there's just not much research. There's a little bit that's coming out. Judson Brewer is doing some things, and there's a couple of other studies that are in the works. But what I would say is that we are finding certain protocols in particular to be very effective with both depression and anxiety. Anxiety in particular, the mindfulness work is really powerful for stress and anxiety. Whether it's using the neurofeedback or not, the neurofeedback helps immensely, but isn't, you don't have to have it. For depression, we actually find that using the focus meditation as a starting point works really well, because you're teaching people to pay attention to something besides whatever they're ruminating about, whatever negative thinking is going on. You're teaching them to shift their attention away from that and not hold on to those negative thoughts. You're shifting to something neutral, which is actually a positive thing. So that's a really good starting meditation for depression. And then once they start, we'll combine that with things like positive psychology and some other work that's not specifically meditation. And then once they start to improve, we'll shift them over to an open heart practice. And that really takes them the rest of the way. If we can get them to start practicing gratitude and using some of the open heart practices, that's what kind of moves that depression all the way to the other side.
Interesting.